Okay, the purpose of these photos as an introduction to the exhibit is to kind of soften people's attitudes and look at how strikingly beautiful some of these creatures are. And so many people regard them as worms or something undesirable. And yet when you look at them, they are really beautiful and they have incredible life histories, a lot of them. For instance, this Cecropia moth caterpillar at the top, it turns into this very large giant silk moth called a Cecropia moth. And I'll talk a little bit about it as we go along, but really in the case of many insects, they're really two different creatures, even though they're the same species. You know, the immature stages are strikingly different, often in appearance and habits, and from the adults. So we can touch on that a little later. This whole exhibit, it barely scratches the surface of what insects are in their lives. And what I've tried to do is put together exhibits that illustrate some aspect of insect ecology, but also use things that most people at some point in their life are somewhat familiar with and have some experience with. And the point of this one is to illustrate how many insects use protective coloration, camouflage, and mimicry to protect themselves. Up here, I don't know if you can get in close on it, but there's an insect called a phasmid, and it mimics dried up leaves and hides itself very well. This is a well-known example, at least theoretically, of two butterflies, one a monarch butterfly, which can be mildly poisonous to birds, and a viceroy butterfly, which is very tasty to birds, but so closely mimics the monarch that in theory it gets eaten less. Down here, it's a common phenomenon in many insects that they have what are called eye spots, which in theory, if the moth's disturbed, it suddenly spreads its wings and all of a sudden you got two big eyes looking at you. The same situation arises with this caterpillar, which is a spicebush swallowtail caterpillar. Now this one is in its fourth stage of larval growth, and at that point they're pretty nearly grown, and they rest during the day on leaves, and the head, which is right in the front, gets pulled up under the thorax and really swells out the thorax, so it looks, at least to me, like a little snake head sitting there. Now in its previous stage, because caterpillars, they go through stages called instars, and they molt their skin at each stage, much like a snake sheds its skin. But in the third instar prior to this, if you were to see this caterpillar, it would be on top of a leaf, but it would be an exact mimic of a bird dropping. So, and this group up here, they're color-coded. These are insects that mimic somewhat dangerous insects like bees and wasps. So here we have some bees actually mixed in, but then moths and flies that look so much like bees that they're often mistaken for bees. So this is an example I use when I'm talking to groups of people. I have two insects here and I ask them, what are they? Inevitably, they tell me they're bumblebees. And I say, well, yes, but which one is the bee? And 80% of the time, they will pick that one. And that's the wrong answer. That is actually a predatory fly called a robber fly. This is a bumblebee. And the robber fly, it flies, it sounds like a bumblebee. The only way you can really tell is that all flies have only two wings, one pair, a forewing. All other insects that have wings have two pairs of wings, a forepair and a hind pair. So this is an exhibit on termites, which is something everybody asks about because you worry about termites in your house. But termites are all social insects. They do not live alone. They live in large colonies. And so here on this side, we have the one species of termite that we have here in Michigan. And if you look carefully, you see the one on the right has very small jaws, and that's a worker termite. The one on the left is a soldier. They're the ones that protect the colony, so they've got these great big jaws. This piece of wood here is termite damage, and I got that out of the house I live in. When I moved into it, it was, I'll bet the termites would have kept me up late night just listening to them. But a good deal of the house was eaten, but that's how much damage they can do. And then at certain points in their colony development, the colony gets overcrowded. And by the way, these are subterranean termites. They live in the ground. Many species of termites in the tropics actually have a nest in trees. But at some point, the colony gets overpopulated. And while normally the workers and soldiers are all female and are repressed as far as being able to reproduce, at some point in the colony, they start producing a reproductive caste, which are winged males and females. And to see one of these swarms, as they call it, is pretty amazing. You see these streaming out of the hole in the ground by the tens of thousands, just a cloud of them, and they scatter all over the countryside and hopefully to them mate and start new colonies. So, but this exhibit is primarily about wood-eating insects. Over here, we have a chunk of beech log that was hollowed out quite nicely in places by a caterpillar called a carpenter worm moth or a large longhorn beetle, which I'll show you later. Then there's other types of wood damage, such as powder post beetle. They bore a little tiny hole into the wood, the larvae do. And if you have them, you can always tell because there'll be a little pile of sawdust down the floor underneath there. And you can see on the surface there's little holes. Now back in the, I think 1980s, if you go and buy new furniture, for some reason those holes were considered cool. So they would actually paint them on the furniture. And down here, this picture are some tropical termites, and they build nests in a tree. And these are the soldiers I'm showing, because if you go up and poke a hole in one of these nests, the soldiers swarm out. And these are really cool because they're a special cast, and they look like little nozzle heads. They've got a little squirt gun on the front of their head that they squirt offensive fluid on any invaders. There are ecological benefits to termites, just like there are to fly maggots. So when I talk to groups, especially kids, one of the things I do is ask how many of them grew up on a farm. And there's always a couple, except at Notre Dame. But so then I ask them, if they understand the word nutrient. Some of them do, some don't. And so then I ask them, have any of you ever seen a farmer or gardener put fertilizer on their land? And yeah, a few of them raised their hands, fine. And I said, what are they doing? And so then I get from the fertilizer to the nutrients in the fertilizer, and talk about, well, do they just put a big pile of this in the field? Oh, no, they spread it out. Well, why did they do that? So that every plant gets some. But my point of all of this is that in nature, every living body is full of nutrients. So how do you spread it out enough for all the living things to utilize it? And one of the ways is through insects like termites and maggots, which we'll talk about later. So something has to take the nutrients out of dead wood and scatter it around in the environment for other organisms to utilize. Another point I want to make about termites, and this is a question I get asked a lot, about people afraid to bring firewood into their house because it may have termites in it. You can't spread termites that way. You can't bring a few worker termites that might be in a dead log into a house and expect them to survive. They're very soft-bodied, and they can't survive outside of the colony. So you are not going to get a termite infestation from bringing firewood into the house. This is an exhibit on one of my entomological heroes. This is about a woman named Sibylla Merian, who lived in the late 1600s into the early 1700s, which at that time in Europe, being a woman, it was not easy. So she is one of the sort of founders of ecology, if you will, before ecology was really a science. And what she did was study European caterpillars and plants. And she wrote 4 books, I think 3 books in the 1600s on that subject. But she was also an incredible artist. And one of the things that she did that was different from what had been done in the past, and that eventually changed natural history illustration forever, was that she depicted plants with a lot of their associated insect fauna. Prior to that, a plant would have been illustrated on one page, and then if there was an insect to be associated with it, that would be painted on another page. But she put them together, which is how they, actually are in nature. And she was born in Germany and eventually ended up living in Amsterdam in Holland. But in 1699, she and her daughter sailed to Suriname in South America, which was, I believe, a Dutch colony at that time. And when you think about that, a single woman traveling alone on a long voyage into a jungle, it was just an extraordinary feat. And she was there for several years and painted a lot of the tropical flora and fauna there. And when she came back, she produced this large book, and that's the size that a lot of natural history books were printed in at the time. And the effort to do just that was extraordinary because they didn't have color printing at that time. So she would have had to have had her artworks engraved by an engraver onto a printing plate, and then it would have been printed in black and white, and then every color page in every book had to be hand colored. And when you think about the effort involved in that, it just blows my mind. But a lot of her initial scientific discoveries were almost dismissed outright by a lot of the leading scientists at the time, who were all men, because a woman can't know this stuff. Ultimately, she got the last word because she was proven right in almost everything. So, I don't know, I just think she deserves some recognition in this exhibit. She died in 1717, and this book, it's a facsimile that was printed by the Royal Dutch National Library on the 300th anniversary of her death. And just before her, there's very little of her work available in the art world because near the end of her life, a few months before she died, everything she had left at that time, she sold to the Russian Tsar Peter the Great. So a lot of it's in Russia now. This is an exhibit just touching on how insects have influenced art in some cases, and there are these two large cases they were done in the very early 1900s. They're very Victorian in style, and this sort of thing started again in the late 1600s, early 1700s. At that time, you had the European colonial powers expanding and taking colonies all over the world. And so the European seaports were just bustling with activity, all these ships coming in from all over the world with a lot of odd stuff that Europeans had never seen. So at the same time, because of that trade, you had the rise of a real merchant class in Europe, many of whom were quite wealthy. And so how to display that wealth? Well, a lot of them had what they called cabinets of curiosities, which were, just oddball collections of really weird foreign stuff that they would display in cabinets. And it was kind of a status symbol to have very large or many cabinets of curiosity. So this sort of art form grew out of that, and actually it was fairly common in the during the Victorian era, at least in this country, where people would make things. Sometimes they would be wreaths with dried flowers in, and vines and stuffed birds and things like that. And so these are two collages made entirely out of insects with a few spiders thrown in, and in the case of this one, 3 bats in there. And I can't imagine how much time it must have taken to do this. Also, I've got displayed some uses of insects now. They are commonly raised on butterfly farms, and sometimes they'll be encased in a little glass case in a wooden base just for setting on your bathroom sink or something. And a quite common insect used in jewelry is the blue morpho butterfly, which we'll see one later. And I've got displayed here some jewelry which was popular in the 1930s and 40s with a blue background, and then some other images imposed on that. And that blue will never fade because the blue part of the jewelry is actually a cutout portion of this blue morpho wing. And even though the butterfly looks blue on the upper surface, there's no blue pigment in there. It's all done with scales that just refract the light and emit this blue light, which is why it's so stable. Up above these two old collages, we have some artwork that is done by the artist Christopher Marley, which does a lot of, I guess, more modern form of insect arrangement and art, and it's, I guess he does it with other animals too, and I find it much more attractive than these. Actually, these look kind of dark to me, dark and scary. So this exhibit has some things that people find generally obnoxious, like mosquitoes. And I often get asked the question of what use are mosquitoes? And what I say sometimes is, well, it depends on who's asking the question. Because if you're a little fish that feeds on mosquito larvae, if you're a dragonfly that might eat flying adult mosquitoes, well, then the answer is going to be different. So one thing I want to point out about mosquitoes is that for this area, I don't know, I think there's probably 30 or 40 different species of mosquitoes, and not all of them bite humans. You do have some invasives, like this Asian tiger mosquito, which is the one that can often spread diseases in urban areas. And here's how the mosquito larvae live in water. They hang upside down, and then they have air tubes that go up, and it's the surface tension of the water that keeps them at the surface. And their pupae also do the same thing. Now, this mosquito down here is a particularly interesting one. It only has a Latin name, Seraphora ciliata, but it is a very large, very aggressive mosquito. If you've got one around, you're going to know it. And by the way, it's only the female mosquitoes that bite. But that one, in the course of its development, according to an old friend of mine, George Craig, who was a world-renowned mosquito expert, each one of those has killed and eaten about 300 to 400 other mosquito larvae in the course of its development. So the point is, and this one I got a picture of because it was feeding on my dog's nose when I was laying on the porch. And when I came out, I saw it, and it was so engorged with blood it couldn't fly anymore. All it could do was hop. But if you see a mosquito that's so big that it kind of scares you, shoot away, shoot off on the neighbors, don't kill it. Also, there are mosquito, kind of endemic mosquito diseases that are spread. One that gets health departments upset is one called Eastern equine encephalitis, which is, it's 100% fatal in horses, and I don't know, 30 to 50% fatal in humans, but in any event, if you ever get it, you will never be the same again. So sometimes they do big spraying programs to try not to knock the mosquito population down. Those are largely publicity events because the life cycle of that particular mosquito is so complicated that it's really hard for people to catch that disease. For instance, a couple of years ago in Michigan, I think 8 people in the state died of EEE. But the health department spread insecticide on huge areas of the landscape. But it turns out that the EEE virus is endemic in Michigan now, as of about 20 years ago. It used to be just an East Coast disease, East Coast and Gulf Coast, and for some reason there's developed a permanent endemic population in Michigan running a thin oval from southwest to up towards Saginaw Bay. But within this area, the reservoir for the virus is a mosquito that only lives in small pools of water underneath the roots of old tamarack trees and swamps. So it's not a common habitat. That mosquito does not bite humans. It only bites cold-blooded prey. So to get a transmission, you have to have this mosquito bite a turtle or a snake or a frog, and then you have to have the same animal bitten by another mosquito that also feeds on warm-blooded prey, say the ones that feeds on cold-blooded prey and birds. And then from there, you have to get it transmitted to another mosquito that bites humans. So it's very, very difficult to get. It's nothing I worry about anyway. Here we have carpenter ants, which are familiar to anyone who burns firewood. And these are large black ants that actually don't eat wood, but they excavate galleries out of old rottenwood. So you can see how intricate some of these galleries can get. And they hibernate in there, but they do not actually eat the wood. Down here are tent caterpillars. These aren't as common as they used to be, but it was quite common in the spring to see a whole tree, particularly a young cherry tree, infested with them. And they would actually defoliate the tree, but after they're gone, the tree will re-leaf, and in 2 or 3 weeks you can hardly tell it was attacked. So they build a large silken nest in amongst the branches, and every day they spin a new covering to the nest, because every day they go out and feed. They all get bigger, so they need more room. And then at some point they finish their growth and pupate and spin cocoons and turn into moths. So caterpillars are very difficult to preserve dry. Usually you have to preserve them in preserving fluid. But there is one technique that can be used that I've used here, which is to inflate the caterpillar. So what you do is drop the caterpillar into hot water and kill it. And then you take it out and you lay it out on your dining room table on a piece of newspaper. And you get some small rod. Say I use a glass rod, or you can even use a pencil. And you start behind the head and start rolling it like a rolling pin. And eventually you get a big bulge at the other end. So you take a pin, you poke a hole in that, and you roll the guts out. And so what you've essentially done is skinned the caterpillar. Then you have a small air compressor, although you can use a balloon, and that is hooked up to an aquarium valve, which regulates the airflow very carefully. And then I use one of these needles that you put on a little hand air pump to blow up basketballs and things like that, and you stick it up the butt end of the caterpillar and brace it at the head, give it a little air, and it blows it up just like a balloon. And you can arrange them in any shape you want, and then you take a hair dryer, just dry the skin out, and voila. So this exhibit here shows 3 different orders of insects. This is an order called the Caddisflies, and these are largely aquatic insects, but what's interesting about them is that the larvae generally build a little structure, a little tube, and that is sort of species specific, and it goes around in the stream bottom or waits and lives inside this little tube, which can be made out of pebbles or pieces of leaves or other vegetative debris. And it's kind of like a turtle shell, so you see them. Here's a picture of one walking around in the bottom, and it's got a leaf tube behind it that it lives in and retreats into when it's threatened. They're a very important group to trout fishermen because they are a good indicator of water quality also. This group, the Neuroptera, or the net-winged insects, are one of my favorites because it's got some really cool ones in. And one of them is called a mantispid, which is a very tiny, almost exact replica of a praying mantis. But it's a completely different order. Okay, these are called Dobsonflies. They are in the order Neuroptera that I just talked about. And it illustrates two things. Number one, the difference between the larval forms and the adult forms. You could easily mistake them for two different animals entirely. The other is the extreme sexual dimorphism between the male and the female. And it's the mandibles in this male are so incredibly enormous that they're absolutely useless. It's kind of like a peacock's tail, which is useless. It just represents something to the peahen. Well, in this case, sexual selection has driven the development of these useless mandibles. So this is an order called the Audionautix, and that includes both dragonflies and damselflies, which are probably familiar to most people. You see them flying over, wet areas, but also out over fields. They do, even though the immature forms are largely aquatic, the adults will range widely over dry areas nearby, hunting other insects. So dragonflies and damselflies are in the group of a number of orders of insects that have what we call an incomplete metamorphosis. Most insects have an egg and a larval stage, and then they go into a resting stage called a pupa, which in the case of butterflies and moths is a cocoon, from which the adult eventually emerges. And when you think of it, that's a pretty remarkable transformation, that one creature can go into a stage where it completely rearranges all the cells in its body into something else. But those orders with an incomplete metamorphosis, they have what are called a nymph. It's not called a larvae. And the nymph molts just like a snake sheds its skin as it gets older. And eventually on the last molt, out comes the adult. So just another example of how different the life forms can be. Now, often you can see this is a dragonfly. And when you see dragonflies and damselflies mating, it's usually the male that is leading, and the female will be connected to the male upside down, and they'll be flying along that way. So the way that happens is that on male dragonflies, I don't know if you can see this, they have what are called claspers. They're specially shaped appendages, and those are designed to fit right around the neck of the female of that species. So it's almost like a lock and key. So he will latch onto the female with these claspers, and then the female will curve her abdomen around under the male, because the male genitalia is actually here in the first abdominal segment. So she's got to fly upside down and curve that abdomen up to get fertilized. And then it's usually the male that leads both of them to a suitable site to lay their eggs, called an ovipositional site. Yeah. So I talked a little earlier about, I think it was in the termite section, on how termites recycle the nutrients in wood. And all dead animals, of course, are full of nutrients, and nature needs some way to recycle them, which is primarily insects. And when I have talked to kids, I ask them if they remember the story of the Pilgrims and the Indians teaching the Pilgrims how to plant corn and put the seed in the ground, and they put a little dead fish in there. Why did they do that? Well, the dead fish is full of nutrients, and that's what feeds the corn plant. So with dead animals, the first insects that usually will come to a body, and they can detect death within very few minutes, because immediately upon death, bacteria in the body get to work on it, and they put out gases that are detected by flies, which then lay their eggs on the dead body, usually initially around orifices such as the mouth or ears, and the maggots proceed to consume it. Adult flies will also feed on fluids from a rotting corpse, as will moths and sometimes butterflies. And if you watch maggots in a dead animal, you'll also find other things that are there feeding on the maggots. Down here are a couple little about inch long road beetles, and you can see them come in and feeding on the maggots, and they're comical to watch because they're real gluttons. So you'll see them with a maggot in their mandibles, and then trying to stuff two more in with their front legs. And you also have maggots that eat other maggots. So everything's interconnected. At the very end of the initial decomposition and recycling process, you will get beetles called domestic beetles that will come and finish off everything else. So a lot of times, like this dead ground squirrel up here, it's essentially emptied of soft tissue, but it still does have bones and dried skin and hair, and that's what the domestic beetles will feed on. So these dead animal insects, necrophorus insects they call them, that's why they are useful in what's called forensic entomology, because in cases where you have a dead body, you're trying to determine, maybe it's been dead a long time, how long ago it died. Often the insects give clues to that. For instance, the maggots that are blowfly maggots, in the cool weather, from winter to very early summer, blue bottle flies are the most common fly, and you can identify their maggots, or you can detect their pupal cases. So you can tell if you find a body and it just has those blue bottle fly characteristics, you can make the assumption that it was before, the death was before, early to mid-June. Later on in the season, it's flies called green bottle flies. So, and if it's if there's still maggots on the body, you can actually identify them and tell what stage they're in, and then from temperature records determine how long ago that the eggs were laid. And sometimes that's the only way to determine, when some animal died. So it is useful, and there are other insects that are useful in that respect too. Some interesting necrophorous insects are a group called the carrion beetles. So these beetles, the adults will feed on dead carcasses, but what's really interesting is that the larvae also feed on dead carcasses. And what some of the species do is they'll actually bury small dead animals like a mouse, and then they process the body underground. They'll strip the hair off, and their saliva will be somewhat of preservative. And then they will dig a chamber out to the side, lay their eggs, and it's usually a male and female together, and they stay with the young until they're developed. And then the young beetles actually feed on this, I call it a mouse meatball. So it's really cool. I've seen it several times where I'll trap a mouse in my house and throw it out in front of the front porch. And twice I've seen it where at night all of a sudden this dead mouse is moving. And a pair of these beetles has located it. They have scouted out a good site to bury it, and then they move it. So they get on their backs and use their legs to kind of lift and shove it that way. And then when they get it there, then they just start excavating under it, and the whole mouse just slowly sinks into the ground. So if you're ever out and you see a dead mouse on its back moving, that's what's going on with it. Okay, this portion of the show talks about 3 different orders of insects. The lice and fleas. Unfortunately, insects the size of a pinhead really don't show up well in a show like this, so I do have just photographs of them. But what I really want to talk about is the order Diptera, which are the flies. Now, most people, when you say fly, they're thinking the housefly. There are actually probably 20,000 species of flies described by science in North America, and many more that are not described by science. And they're quite variable, and actually just about my favorite order. And so they span a wide range of habits and appearance. I often have people tell me, when I talk about mosquitoes, they say, well, you ought to see the size of the mosquitoes at my house, this big around. And what those actually are these flies called crane flies, which are they're quite large, but they don't even have functional mouths, so they they aren't going to bite you. And if they did feed on anything, it would most likely be pollen. A lot of those are aquatic. They're immature forms, although some lay their eggs in rotten wood. And this other group of flies up here called the robber flies, those are all predatory insects. And they're voracious predators. And some of them are generalist, others specialize in certain habitats, some of them specialize in certain insect prey. And they're a very large group and very common. When I was farming, I would often be on a tractor in the spring working in the field, and it was an open tractor, no cab on it, and quite frequently one of these robber flies would land in my sleeve because it had just caught some prey animal and would sit on my sleeve while it consumed it. It sucked them dry. Also, mosquitoes, by the way, are flies, technically. They belong in that family. There's a large group of these large flies called tabanid flies, and they are the deer flies, horse flies, the biting flies. But there are, like I said, probably at least 20,000 species in North America that are described, and I just can't talk about all of them. There's too many. So up there's a fly called a warble fly, and I wish I had brought the maggot along. You often see, it's very rare to see the adults, but when the maggots are seen, it's usually because they have bored under the skin of a kitten. Now, these warble flies will lay their eggs in areas near, typically where rabbits and mice live. And then when the animal comes along, the body heat causes the egg to pop open and flips a maggot out on it. Or sometimes the fly lays directly on the animal. So then the maggot bores under the skin and causes what's called a warble. And inside that warble, just under the skin, it actually raises bacteria that it feeds on. The interesting thing is that and like I said, people mostly see them when they're in kittens, although typically the victim is a rabbit or a mouse. But if you're going to take the maggot out of the warble, you can actually take a surgical scissors and cut across the kitten's skin to get the maggot out. So the interesting things going on there are the maggot raising bacteria within this warble, and it's totally anesthetized so that the kitten doesn't feel it. And within about 2 days after the maggot leaves, the whole thing is healed up. So there's some real interesting biochemical things going on there. I did find a maggot of one of those once. I had trapped a mouse on my kitchen counter. And I don't know, I just left it there the whole day. So later on, when I came home, I noticed this great big maggot about that long rolling around the kitchen counter. So these things do get in the bellies of mice too. And this one must have figured, well, I'm almost grown. This mouse is a dead end, so I'm going to get out of here and go pupate and turn into an adult. So it's kind of an interesting story as to how I collected my warblefly maggot. So I want to describe the classification for a minute here, and I want to compare it to the postal system. So if you're mailing a letter or a package anywhere in the world, the first thing you'd want to do is send it to the right country. And in classification, the phylum that an animal is in is sort of equivalent to the country. So here we have several different, well, 4 different phyla, and the corals are one, the mollusks are one, or shelled creatures. Echinoderms, another one, a starfish is an example of that. And then you have the arthropoda, which includes insects, scorpions, spiders, creatures like that. The next step down is the class, and that would be equivalent in the postal system to the state where the item is addressed to. So these are broken up into different classes: the crustaceans, which are like the crayfish, the millipedes, the spiders, and then the insects. The insects are their own class. Underneath the class is the order, and this would be equivalent in the postal system to a particular small town, or in the case of a large city, the zip code. Below that, and it's also, the orders are divided up into groups that most people commonly know. In other words, the beetles, the moths, the bees and wasps, or the Hymenoptera. Below that, we have the family. So each of these orders is divided into a number of families. And so in the case of these moths, we have 4 different families: the Noctuidae, the Paralidae, the Geometridae, and the Nymphalidae. So that would be equivalent to, like I said, the town or zip code. Then we go to the genus, which is the next step down. The plural is genera. And this would be equivalent to the particular street address or house or building that the letter is going to. And so the genera collectively make up a family. Below that, in each genus, the individual species are grouped, and this would be equivalent to the individuals at a given address. In other words, members of a family at a house on Elm Street in Nowhere Town, USA. All right, this is the order Hymenoptera, and this is one of the largest of insect orders in terms of species. It has a lot of insects that are familiar to people, like bumblebees and honeybees, as well as social wasps, like yellow jackets and hornets. But the bulk of species in the order are in this group, mostly in the family Ichneumonidae, which is in a group of Hymenoptera that are called the parasitic Hymenoptera. So there are thousands and thousands of species of those, and they almost all are parasitic. Well, they're parasitic, or what they call a parasitoid, on other insects. And so you often see them with filaments coming out of the back of their body. And what those are not stingers. They are tools to bore into something. And like this one here, there are 3 filaments. The 2 thicker ones on the outside work together like a saw. And they can drill down through 3 or 4 inches of wood down to where there's another insect boring through the wood, and then there's a very slender filament in the center called an ovipositor, and they stick that down and deposit an egg in that hole. And then when the egg hatches, the ichneumon larvae eats up the other insect boring in the wood. So these have a huge effect on insect ecology or invertebrate ecology, in that they are biocontrols on many other insects. And some of them they've got fascinating life histories. They're so complicated, you just wonder how they ever survive at all. So, but they're also very difficult to identify. I've got one set of books written by a husband and wife team from University of Michigan. I think it's like 17 volumes just to identify the ichneumon wasp. And then down here we got some of the social wasps, like let's see. These are, some of these here. And then there are solitary wasps that are often hunting wasps and provision their nest with other insects. For instance, this cicada killer, which is the largest wasp that we have around here, the females will dig a hole in the ground, and they're usually communal in that there are many of them trying to nest in the same most favorable spot. So sometimes you'll see hundreds of these things flying over the ground, and they've each dug a little hole, and then they go out and they find a cicada and sting it in the neck and paralyze it, and then carry it back and put it down in the hole, lay an egg on it, and then cover the hole back up. And then the cicada is just paralyzed, so when the wasp larvae hatches, it's got fresh meat to eat, and then it pupates in the soil, and the next year out comes an adult cicada killer. There are more on some of these Hymenopteras later on, and we can talk more about them, and they're better illustrated in some other exhibits. But this is the order Lepidoptera, which includes all butterflies and moths. And one of the things I want to point out here is up in this corner, these are tropical species or subtropical species that I've collected. I just added those in for a little extra color. But all of the rest of these are local Michigan species. And I think we have roughly 3,000 species of moths and butterflies in Michigan. But it's a very diverse group and fun to work with. So how do you tell the difference between a moth and a butterfly? It's something that you will generally, over time, begin just to recognize the general body form. But butterflies usually, at the end of their antenna, they have a little club. And moths don't have that. Moth antenna is usually very hair-like, or in the case of these, what they call the large silk moths, they look like they have, the males look like they have feathers for antenna. And the reason for that is that these giant silk moths, they don't feed as adults. They have very, very short lifespans. The females carry all the fat that they need in their body to ripen their eggs. And the males' only function in this world is to find a female. And they're very good at it. They have these huge plumose antennae, and they can follow a pheromone trail of a female. And a pheromone is a specific message sending chemical. So the female releases this pheromone, and the males can follow it in concentrations as low as a couple molecules per liter of air. It may take them some time, but they do. And that pheromone molecule locks into certain receptor cells on the antenna. It's just like a lock and key approach. That pheromone molecule will only fit in that cell, and that's how the males find the females. So these moth antennae, they don't have a club on the end. They're usually kind of hairy, although some of them can be very thread-like. And most moths are night flyers, with some exceptions. Most butterflies are day flyers. So some moths are too, like these, what they call clear-wing moths that mimic bees and wasps. So that's the easiest way to tell the difference quickly. Okay, this is a kind of something I'm proud of, even though it isn't much to look at. But a lot of insects are still to be described by science. So, and it's not uncommon for technically amateur entomologists to come up with new species, which then are described by people that specialize in them. So this is one that I caught that actually ended up being a new species and got named after me. Granted, it's nothing like this big, beautiful Luna moth or Cecropia moth, but hey, it's something. So this is kind of the general life cycle of a butterfly. You would have started with an egg, which then hatched into a larvae. And these are monarch butterfly larvae feeding on their food plant, milkweed. Now, as they go through 4 different stages called instars. They have first instar, second, third, and fourth instar. The fourth instar is usually the last, although sometimes there's 5. At the end of that, when the caterpillar is done growing, it will attach itself under something. It might be a leaf or a branch. And it's called a prepupal stage. And at this point, its body is rearranging the cells. And when that is all done, then the skin will split open and out will pop this chrysalis. Or it's a cocoon or a pupa, but in butterflies it's called a chrysalis. And that would be kind of equivalent to a human baby getting to be a teenager and then sleeping for a month and then waking up a elephant or something. I mean, it's that radical a change. And then the inside the chrysalis, you can actually see the wing veins developing. It undergoes further cellular rearrangement until it changes into the adult body. Okay, this is the order Coleoptera, which are the beetles. And the beetles are probably the largest order of insects that there is. In fact, it's kind of estimated that 1/3 of all living animals are actually beetles. Although it would not surprise me if in the future they were surpassed by the wasps and the Hymenoptera. But beetles have just an incredible diversity of form and habits, and they're some of the largest insects that we have too. I've got some larger tropical ones in here just for effect. And these large beetles from Central America, they've got great big grubs, and the indigenous peoples in South and Central America will go out and hack a tree, a wound in a tree. The beetle will lay eggs in there, and then they'll go back a few months later and harvest these great big long grubs to eat. And insects, by the way, are extremely healthy to eat because of the fat levels. So if you're ever stranded out in the woods and you're going to be out there for a long time, you got a choice between rabbits and beetle grubs, you'll do better on the beetle grubs because small animals have very little fat. So this is a large group of beetles up here called the longhorn beetles. And they all have extremely long antennae. And almost all of them are borers in various plants, a lot of them in woody plants like trees and shrubs. And they're one of the groups of beetles that collectors really love to get because they're quite pretty, and there's a lot of them, a lot of diverse life histories. In fact, there's one of these that the larvae is extremely slow developing, and it can take it bores into wood, but it can take anywhere from 10 to 40 years to actually mature. And then stag beetles are another very noticeable group. Those are all predatory. Most of these scarab beetles actually bore in the ground and live on plant roots. So June beetles, for instance, in this area are scarab beetles. And the reason that you often have so many molehills on your lawn in the spring is because those scarab beetle larvae are getting larger and the moles are going all over the place eating them up. Some pest insects, like the Japanese beetle, that's a scarab beetle. And scarab beetles have quite a history in, with certain civilizations. They were sacred in ancient Egypt, and some of them, a lot of them too, are called dung beetles because they bury cattle poop. In places like Australia, where the Europeans introduced cattle, they had a problem at one point because they didn't have any dung beetles to eat the manure. So they had to introduce dung beetles to do that.
I have a question about the stag beetles. They're really common in the U.S. and you said they're predatory. What do they prey on?
Other insects primarily, or small, or spiders, things like that. There's another very large group called the carabid beetles that they're predatory also. There's one great big one we have around here. You can't see it very well, but it's bright metallic green on the back. It's called a caterpillar hunter. You very often see them on oak trees running up and down looking for other caterpillars to eat. Okay. Yeah, but the larvae of these stag beetles live in dead wood usually, or decaying wood. We've got an exhibit of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different orders. The first one is the order Homoptera, and these are all insects, both the Homoptera and the Hymenoptera, which are called the true bugs, all have sucking mouth parts. Now, this order Hymenoptera, it's always said that all, it's common name are the true bugs. So all bugs are insects, but not all insects are bugs. Bugs have their own common name for the order. And they all have sucking mouth parts, which is a sharp proboscis that they, insert into something. Either if they're predatory, they feed on other insects or spiders, things like that, or they feed on plants. Almost all of the Homoptera are plant feeders, and these include groups like aphids and woolly aphids and cicadas. They're very common. Some of these small plant hoppers are just around by the tens of millions if you're out in grasslands. And they're significant food for other creatures. The Hemipterans are kind of evenly divided between those that are predatory and those that are herbivorous. The predatory ones, and there's some pretty striking ones like this giant water bug, or this water scorpion, that they're aquatic, they live in water. Each of those are big enough to also feed on like tadpoles and small fish as well as other insects. Oftentimes these giant water bugs are attracted to lice around swimming pools. What I can tell you is that you do not want to get bitten by one. I did once. I was sitting in an outdoor wedding. All of a sudden, one of these smaller ones comes down, nails me right on the arm. It was like I got hit with a sledgehammer, and it was really impaired for a good 6 or 8 hours. So some bugs, like these stink bugs, one illustrated there, you know, in last number of years, probably 10, 12 years, there's been an invasive stink bug from Asia. And that's been a real problem, and there are massive numbers of them in some years. Unfortunately, a lot of our native stink bugs very closely resemble that Asian species in appearance, although the Asian one is generally larger. But most of these stink bugs are actually predatory on other insects, and some feed on plants, but so they are, in a sense, a very important biocontrol on other insects. Here, this one has killed a tent caterpillar, and they inject the venom in, which immediately immobilizes the prey and begins digesting the inside of the prey animal. And so then the bug sits there and looks like it's drinking a caterpillar milkshake or something. This is a group called the stoneflies. These again are not a very pretty group to look at. They're kind of dull, but their immatures are aquatic, and they're a very important aquatic insect and water quality indicator. Mayflies, the same thing. Sometimes I have seen swarms of mayflies because they're the Latin name of the order is Ephemeroptera. That's because their life cycle is so short as adults, maybe a few hours or at most a few days. So when they're going to reproduce, they got to have everybody out there at the same time. And I have up along Lake Huron seen mass emergence of mayflies, and it looks like snow draped over everything, buildings, street lights, and so they can, I think it'd probably be slippery driving on the roads. But they, again, are a very important aquatic insect who is a water quality indicator. And fly fishermen love time flies that resemble mayflies, because when they emerge and they're touching down in the water to drop their eggs in, that's when the fish like to get them. So if you can tie a fly that looks like a mayfly, you're in good shape. This is an order called the Homoptera. It's called scorpionflies, and they're all easy to recognize because if you look at their head, it looks like they've got a trunk like an elephant, and they all do. The reason they're called scorpion flies is the end of the abdomen on the male, how it's swelled up like a scorpion sting. But that's the male genitalia. But that's why they're called scorpion flies, because of that characteristic. This is a group of insects called the orthopteroid insects. And they're a group of closely related orders and suborders to the Orthoptera, which are the grasshoppers, katydids, and crickets. So these are all closely related in an evolutionary sense. So here we have mantids, which commonly called praying mantids. We have two species here, the European mantid up at the top and Chinese mantid at the bottom. Prior to European settlement, there were no native mantids in northeastern North America. These were both imported by Europeans, supposedly because they're a good insect, which is a designation that I generally don't use, because good or bad, evil is a judgment character thing. So, but the Chinese mantids can be considered invasive in some circumstances. They have been known to kill hummingbirds and actually eat through the eye to get into the brain, eat the brain out. This is a picture here of a mantid that's eating the head off a grasshopper and is going down to the rest of the body. But they are interesting insects to watch, and if you see one of these big Chinese mantids on the side of a building, they're watching you all the time. You're not quite sure whether he's going to jump or not. I've never seen them do so. Yeah, so that's mantids. And they, after they eat, they're very clean. They're like a cat washing themselves. They wash their legs and face and get all cleaned up. Cockroaches, they've been around a very, very, very long time, since many millions of years. Very resilient insect. In fact, when I lived in New York City, where they have a lot of cockroaches, I at one point had a coqui tree frog for a pet. And one day I fed it a cockroach out of the building and immediately killed it. These cockroaches were so resistant to any pesticides that they were poisoned themselves. Earwigs. Earwigs are their own order, and I have no idea why they call them earwigs. Supposedly some fear that they would actually get in your ear. I've only heard of one actual case of that where it had to be extracted. There are a number of native earwig species here in Michigan, but there is also an invasive one called the European earwig, which was probably brought in through the bedding plant industry or places like that. Okay, then we have the grasshoppers and katydids and crickets. I've got a couple tropical ones here. This real pretty one with the pink hind legs. That group, they live in the tree canopy in Central and South America. Some of them are much larger and have iridescent purple hind wings. They're very beautiful animals, but you very seldom see them at ground level. These insects are called phasmids or walking sticks. This is a typical walking stick that we have in Michigan. We only have one species. These others are from Southeast Asia and just included as an example of how large some of these insects can get. is an exhibit on plant galls. And plant galls are very specifically shaped structures and usually only occur on one or a few different kinds of plants. They are caused either by insects or small mites. There can be animals other than insects that cause them. But basically what happens is that the adult lays an egg in or on a plant, and chemicals from the immature insect or the adult cause the plant to grow tissue in a very specific way around the young insect. So in a gall like this, which you find in oak leaves, or this one that you find in goldenrods, if you were to cut it open, you would find a little immature insect in there. In this case, it's a fly maggot. And the advantage is, of course, that this thing has an almost impenetrable house to live and feed in. And so anyway, most plants have galls. They're very common. They generally don't hurt the plants. And of the insects that make them, they can be aphids, they can be wasps, they can be flies, they can be beetles in some cases. So they're very ubiquitous throughout the plant kingdom, but they're all very specific in form and host. And the easiest ones to see are these goldenrod galls. And you start to see those in late summer. They persist through the winter because the pupa of whatever insect made it is up near the surface and then chews its way out in the spring. But in the winter, you'll see small woodpeckers alight in other plants and pecking at those galls to get out the insects. Some of them can be quite large and striking, like these oak apple galls. They can be that big around. They're made by a wasp. And, so it's galls. Okay, this is a case exhibit on ants, and I'm really fond of ants. They are social insects. In other words, they have to live in a colony. You can't have individual ants out as being lone rangers. And so here I cover tropical and subtropical leaf-cutting ants, but also some aspects of our local ants. And one of the most important things that people don't know about ants here is that in our temperate forests, like we have in this area, ants actually disperse the seeds of most of the woodland spring wildflowers. And the way they do that is that, and this is an example of a trillium flower, which is familiar to a lot of people. But the seeds, like you see here, they're brown, and then they have a white material attached to them. That white material is a structure called an elaiosome, and it contains compounds that are really kind of essential to ant larval development. So the minute an ant finds one, they carry it back to their nest and they eat off the elaiosome and feed most of it to their larvae. And then they don't actually eat the seed, so they take the seed and they chuck it in their midden, which is the ant garbage dump. And it's actually the microclimate, micronutrient conditions in that midden that are optimal for the germinating of these seeds, which is why you tend to get big patches of them throughout the woods. And it's funny, you can see ants waiting down under a trillium plant with ripe seeds on it, just waiting for them to fall. They also farm other insects. So this is a picture of a tree hopper, which is a member of the Orthoptera order that I talked about before, that feed on the plant ironweed. And the tree hoppers suck the juices out of the ironweed, but they suck out way more than they need, and so it comes in one end and out the other, and that's what the ants are gathering, just like humans milking cows. And they protect the tree hoppers. They protect them from other insect predators. If the plant gets too sickly, they may move them to another plant. Sometimes they even take them down into their ant nest at night to protect them during a different season or adverse conditions. And this part here is on leaf-cutting ants. And leaf-cutting ants are in many ways so much like human societies. So this is a nest in Belize. It probably covered half an acre of land, a lot of land, went probably 40 feet deep in the ground. And inside there are a lot of specialized workers. Most of the workers are out cutting leaves from the surrounding forest trees. And here you see how they do that. They work together to cut these chunks, and then they carry them back. So throughout the forest, there'll be these little well-worn paths. And at certain times of the day, you just see millions of these things streaming along. It makes me think of an aerial view of a Los Angeles freeway at rush hour. And they go out and they gather these leaf pieces, bring them back to the nest, and there are certain workers in the nest that chew these things up and make sort of an ant salad leaf salad out of it. And then there's a fungus that is only found in these ant nests that they grow on this chewed up leaf substrate. And that's the only place that fungus exists. And that's what the ants feed on, is that fungus. So when I look at that, I look at these ants, they got everything so perfectly, working so perfectly. And I think, gee, how imperfect human society is when compared with ants. And these are some kind of cool ants. This is a little bit about what are called acacia ants. So in warmer parts of the world, there's a group of trees called acacia trees. And all the acacia trees everywhere in the world except Australia have these big nasty thorns on them to protect them from browsing animals. Well, in Central America anyway, that's where these came from. There are ants called acacia ants that only live on acacia trees. And they take over the tree, and each thorn on the tree will be a satellite extension of the larger colony. So it's kind of like apartments in a big apartment building. And there you can see the ant go in the little holes, tip of the thorn, but inside it's just a whole little ant nest. And the acacia tree produces these orange tips to the end of the leaves, and that's what the acacia ants feed on. So in return for the food, the acacia ants protect the tree. You don't want to get near an acacia tree and look cross-eyed at it, because there'll be all these ants out there watching you. They even clear weeds from under the tree to help the acacia grow. It's been experimentally established that acacia trees without ants will not thrive. This exhibit is looking at the nest of various Hymenoptera, primarily wasps and some bees. Over here we have the nest of an organ pipe mud dauber, and it's named that because the tubular nest supposedly resemble the tubes on a pipe organ. So they are made out of mud, and the female wasp goes out and gathers about the size of a BB. And she comes back and she starts to plaster lines of mud into this cylindrical form. And as she gets the nest completed, she goes out hunting for orb-weaving spiders. These are the spiders that spin the webs and have big abdomens. She stings them, it paralyzes them, and she carries them back and stuffs, a number of spiders in the end of this tube. When it's full, and it's divided into chambers, so you can see how the exit holes show how the chambers are spaced. When she gets it filled with spiders, she lays an egg and then seals it up and then starts the next chamber. So when the wasp larvae hatches, they have fresh meat to eat because the spiders haven't decayed because they aren't dead, they're just paralyzed. And then the larvae completes its life cycle in there, forms a pupae inside the chamber, and then the following season chews its way out through the mud to the outside. In subsequent years, the mud daubers never reused the nest, but in subsequent years, other wasps, smaller, may come in and remodel certain chambers in there. Like this one is taken one chamber and made, 4 separate chambers, which it provisions with small caterpillars and not spiders. Down here we have potter wasps, which also use mud, but they build these nest structures on leaves or on twigs, and they look just like a ceramic jar. And they're small, but they're quite pretty to look at. And then this wasp will fill that with various paralyzed insects and lay an egg and seal it up. So it's kind of just a different form of the mud dauber. Other wasp will build an open comb nest, and these Polistes wasps are very common on buildings where they're building open comb nests on the underside of the eaves. They're usually pretty docile and mild. And one of their main foods is flies. So in a way, they might be something that you want to keep around. Yellow jackets, on the other hand, especially the ones that build a nest in the ground, can be a real surprise because they actually excavate a nest chamber underground, big area, and then create a paper nest, like you see here, which hangs from the roof of the chamber. The interesting thing is that even though they've excavated all this dirt, you will never see a speck of it where the hole comes out of the ground. I don't know what they do with it. They must carry it away a few grains at a time and drop it somewhere. But anyway, those nests are hard to see, and you usually find them starting in August when you mow over them, or you get some up your pant leg. But it is an actual paper nest, but just built in an underground chamber. Now, nests such as this bald-faced hornet's nest, those are usually in trees or shrubs. They're the largest nesting wasp that we have. If you look at it, you can see the nest walls are quite thick and full of air pockets, and that insulates the nest very well, because it's important to the wasp to be able to control the temperature to some extent for their young larvae. And inside that paper envelope, they call it, then you have a series of combs, honeycombs like this, not honeycombs, but they're combs, and that's where they raise their larvae. These wasps are fairly large. They're very aggressive and not real tolerant of you messing around with them. They are mostly carnivores, though, and they do feed on other insects. So wasps have a very definite impact on the ecology, and I wouldn't want a world without them. But this is an exhibit of bees, and what I want to note first is that most people, when you say bee, the image of a bumblebee comes to mind, or a honeybee, very familiar to most people. However, in Michigan, we have some 450 different species of bees, and most of them are very small and very important to the environment in terms of pollinating plants. So some of the other bees that you will see are these halictid bees, which, along with other species, actually nest underground. They are not social insects, but they are communal insects. In other words, a number of females will nest in an area. They'll dig a central shaft, and then off of that shaft are pathways to each individual female's nest. So it's kind of like an apartment building in a way. And there are quite a number of bees, native bees that do that. Leaf-cutting bees, if you have plants in your yard that you see these edges chewed up, well, it's probably leaf-cutting bees. So they go in and they cut an almost perfect circle. Female folds it up under her abdomen, carries it in her legs, takes it back, and they usually nest in holes in wood. So she'll line the inside of that hole with these pieces of leaves, and then it's divided into quite a number of chambers. So in this one up here is 1, 2, 3, 6, 7, 8 different chambers. And when she gets the first one done, just like the mud dauber, then she seals it up, or provisions it with pollen, lays an egg, and then seals it up, and then starts the next chamber. And these are very important bees in the sense that they spread an awful lot of pollen around in wild plants. And they're just fascinating to watch, to think how they can cut those little circles out and then carry it back and make this beautiful nest. I've also seen their nest underneath asphalt shingles, so they can utilize a lot of different situations for nest building. Carpenter bees, they're an annoyance to a lot of people because they make their nest in perfectly good lumber. So they'll start by boring a hole into the lumber. But as you can see, this end view, once they're inside, they take a 90-degree turn and dig a tunnel. I mean, you could hardly do a series of holes that precise on a drill press in a machine shop. I mean, they're perfectly round and spaced and straight through the board. And in there, these bees do just what the leaf-cutting bees and halicted bees do. They provision the nest with pollen. They go out and gather pollen, pack it in there, and then lay an egg. Unfortunately for the carpenter bees, there's also a large bee fly that is a parasitoid of carpenter bees. So the female fly will hover outside the entrance to the nest there, and she'll flick little maggots in there, and then the maggots will end up eating the bee larvae and the pollen. But that's the way nature works. Here's honeybees. The European honeybee that we have here, I know that's a bee people know the most and they're worried about the most as a pollinator health. Honeybees are an alien species in North America. They were not here before the Europeans brought them. And they provide a lot of services to our agriculture in terms of pollinating fruit crops and nut crops, things like that, and of course honey and beeswax. But there's some research that indicates that they do have somewhat of a negative impact on the native bee populations. This is a little bees in Central America where a lot of the little rural houses have a little bee nest right beside their door. They're stingless bees. And those bees produce a honey that's sweeter than the European honeybee honey, although they produce very little of it. This is a type of beehive. It's called a skep. And this one is characteristic of many Eastern European cultures prior to the mid 1800s. So when these peoples would immigrate to the United States, they would bring a lot of their cultural traditions with them, and one of them was beekeeping. And this was probably made by an immigrant at one point who then didn't use it, and once the modern hive system came into effect, abandoned it. At any rate, it's woven out of vines, as you see. It could be bittersweet or something like that, and then plastered over with mud and horse manure. And there would be an entrance here and up here, and the bees would just build their combs in there, and then in the fall the people would extract it. So it probably had just one use. This is a type of modern beehive. The hive system we use today was developed in the early 1850s and very, very quickly adopted by almost all beekeepers. This particular one was patented by a man from Dowagiac named James Hedden, who was invented artificial fishing lures and formed a Hedden Bait Company. But he was a world-class beekeeper, and so he patented this, I think, around the very early 1900s. But it's similar to the types of hives in use today. This is an exhibit on just wasps and hornets, some of which I've already talked about. For instance, these bald-faced hornets is the ones that make the large paper nest and yellow jackets. And but this is talking about a wasp, the genus Polistes. And so a lot of people regard wasps as pests. And these brown Polistes wasps often build their nest on the underside of building eaves. And because they're wasps, people are afraid of them. They're actually very mild-mannered. But in this case, this wasp, they're primarily predators. So it is killed and is eating a large biting horsefly. So the question is it beneficial or non-beneficial? To my mind, it's beneficial. A lot of wasps are parasitoid wasps. I talked a little bit about those in the Hymenoptera exhibit in the Ichneumonidae. Ichneumonidae includes a lot of these. But a lot of them are what we call parasitoids. Okay, they aren't parasites technically, because a parasite generally doesn't kill its host, but a parasitoid is a one victim predator. So this is commonly seen in gardens. This is a tomato hornworm, which is obviously a tomato eater. And this has been attacked by a couple different possible parasitoid insect families. And the female has laid eggs in that caterpillar, and then when the wasp eggs hatch, the larvae eat out the insides of the caterpillar. It doesn't kill it exactly, but it will never be able to transform into an adult. So then the larval caterpillars, when they're grown, or larval wasps are grown, they chew through the skin of the caterpillar and they spin a cocoon on its back. And they will stay on the caterpillar's back until they go through their pupation and emerges adult wasp, and then the caterpillar will die. This is our largest wasp, called a cicada killer. You can see a cicada which just emerged from its shell, and the cicada killers are their only prey is cicadas. So they come out in late July. The cicadas emerge again late July, early August. When you hear cicadas in the trees, you know summer's half over. But cicada killers are large wasps that help control cicada populations. So the females find a spot to dig a hole, and usually they're, again, communal nesters in that many of the female wasps will find the same site suitable for nesting. So you have a lot of them digging their little holes. And then they go out and they hunt a cicada, they sting it in the neck and paralyze it, and then bring it back, put it down inside the hole, lay an egg, and cover it up. So again, like other parasitoids, when the egg hatches, the larvae has fresh meat to eat and consumes the cicada, is done with its growth, it pupates, and the next year a new cicada killer comes out. These wasps are the Ichneumonidae wasps that I talked about earlier. A lot of them are large and pretty spectacular. There's a photograph of one actually drilling down into wood, and then it's going to lay an egg in there. I think I talked about that earlier. Here, these look like ants, but these are actually wingless wasps called velvet ants. And they, like these little cuckoo wasps, they actually lay their eggs into solitary ground nesting bee nest. So they will watch to see when the bee leaves and then sneak in, lay their egg in the bee's nest, which then that larvae consumes the bee's larvae plus eats its pollen store. Okay, these are spiders. Spiders are not insects. They are arachnids. I don't know, I find spiders very fascinating, even though at one point in my life I had a very severe arachnophobia. This is a commonly seen spider in gardens, open grasslands. It's called a garden spider. And if you ever, they're an orb weaver, which means they spin one of these intricate flat nets, webs between plants. So if you ever see one, and you want to see how they operate, get a grasshopper, and throw it into that web. The spider will immediately run out, bite it, to paralyze it, and then spin a web storage bag over it. These are wolf spiders. They're fairly large spiders, although not our largest. And these are nursery web spiders, which are our largest. Some nursery web spiders around here could be this big around. The way you tell the difference is that the females, nursery web spiders, carry their egg sacs in their jaws. Wolf spiders attach it to the back of their abdomen. And if they ever lose that egg sac, they spend a lot of time walking around looking for it. If they can't find it, they often glue something else like a rabbit pellet onto the back of their abdomen, so it feels like they're hauling one around. Of the dangerous spiders, this is a brown recluse spider, and this is a photograph of an actual bite. The brown recluse spiders are not native to Michigan, but they are sometimes brought into the area by travelers. And if they do get in a house, they can multiply and persist, through cold weather. Their bites are, in the worst case scenario, very severe. All venomous bites have a great many variables that affect how severe it is. Number one, where the bite is, how much venom was injected, the potency of the venom at that time, what a person's general health is. A lot of things that can affect it. But anyway, these brown recluse spiders, if it's untreated, and up until at least a few years ago, maybe even now, the only treatment was to actually cut out that portion of affected tissue. If it's untreated, this venom will, move through the body gradually and can affect a whole lot of other organs. It must be incredibly potent and like move a molecule at a time or something. But this spider came from a woman in Centerville who was bitten, and she saved the spider. She drew some things about it and then described how very sick she got from the bite. And then there's tarantulas, which generally are not that venomous. You might, most of them are going to be like a bee or wasp sting. This spider here, this is a drawing or painting out of Sibylla Merian's book. It's called the Goliath bird-eating spider in South America. And she was the first one to discover it. And here she painted it, actually feeding on a hummingbird the spider caught. These things are really big. They can weigh like a couple pounds. And I was in University of Michigan collections one year. I forget what I was doing. Anyway, this is, behind the scenes stuff. And on top of a cabinet, there's a large wooden case. And I opened it up and just about jumped out of my skin. That spider had to have been that big around. So here we have jumping spiders, which are actually my favorites. And most of them are small, and they leap around. And the abilities of these spiders are just extraordinary to me. I was working on something outside once, and There was a deer fly, one of these biting tabanid flies that I showed you earlier, was buzzing around my head, you know, driving me nuts. And I noticed on top of what I was working on, there was a little jumping spider up there. And at one point I saw that jumping spider shoot about 12 or 14 inches out in thin air and grab that fly right out of the air. And I thought to myself, what kind of mathematics does that take in that little brain to figure out how fast it has to go, how much it has to lead it? And I thought that the American military spent billions of dollars trying to figure that out, how to, you know, shoot things out of the sky, and the spiders they're just incredible little creatures. These are crab spiders, which have some color changing ability to, you know, match the flower that they're sitting on. And then they orient themselves in just the direction that any insect coming in to land on that flower would come and grab it. On a dewy morning in summer, sometimes you'll see these silken structures all over the yard. And that's due claim to funnel weaving spiders' webs. They spin these funnels, which then insects get caught in or filtered down into where the spider's waiting. And then we do have in Michigan black widow spider. It's called the northern widow here. The more dangerous ones are found down south. This is a northern widow, and this is a southern black widow, which is just captured and killed and is eating a ringneck snake.